Welcome back to the Crochet Chronicles, our friends at yarnspirations.com. We have 12 tips for learning to knit. Now, as many of you know, I learned to knit as a kid. I just did the knit stitch and the purl stitch. I didn't even know the names of those stitches when I was a child. And I decided to re-pick it back up in my mid-30s before the crochet crowd, and as my entry level to get back into it, and I only did the knit stitch and the purl stitch again. I decided again, 2017, to try knitting again, and I just did some basic stitches, but I never did any kind of real projects with it. I was just doing the basics and I lost my interest. So now it's 2022, I'm back at it. One of my lifelong dreams was to knit my own hat for myself. I just want to be able to say that I can do it. I see people doing it, I'm like, why can't I? So I'm here in 2022, and what I decided to do over the last 2 weeks is to seriously give myself an opportunity to learn to knit, and I've created my own hat, and I am really quite excited. So I have 12 tips for you today on things that you could be benefiting from what I've learned in the last 2 weeks. So tip number one, expect to make mistakes. If you're just starting this thing and you've never knit a day in your life, your stitch consistency will be inconsistent and you will probably have mistakes within the pattern itself. So what you have to do is give yourself the mental permission to saying that this first pattern may have mistakes. You're going to try not to make those mistakes, but if there are those mistakes, you use those mistakes as a learning lesson. Why did I make the mistake? And evaluate what went wrong so that you can improve. So use your first few projects to be the leaping board to trying to understand knitting when it's on your needles, and that will help you. So let's move on. Tip number two, if you're feeling frustrated, put the damn thing down. Just put it down, just walk away from the project and come and revisit it. A fresh mind is a better mind. So if you're just sitting there and you're hating, you got to hate on for this thing, it's not going to be fabulous. So put the thing down, go have a cup of coffee, cup of tea, water, whatever you have, maybe even have some dessert or something, and just put it away and then bring it back out when your mind is clear and ready to go again. So tip number two is put it down when you're feeling frustrated. If you're a crocheter, you know that a hat takes about 2 to 3 hours. I want to let you know that the journey is the scenic route. And when I was thinking about, my goodness, I could actually have 2 or 3 hats done by the time I finish one knit hat. The stitch work is different. The look is different. The feel of the yarn is different because of the way that it's done. So you got to get out of your mind that speed is everything. And in practice, you will speed up. So when I was doing my first hat, I noticed that I was 3 days doing the hat. I'm almost down to 1 day. And so you will speed up, and it would actually be a relatively quick process in order to get that to happen. So don't expect that this is the NASCAR race. It's not. It's a journey, and it's a different kind of journey than crochet. When you learn to knit, and maybe you're a crocheter, and maybe you're not either of the yarn arts, you are creating new brain waves and new connections within your mind in order for you to be exercising your mind. So if you eat, sleep, drink, whatever, go to bed, and you keep doing that over and over, your mind gets stuck in a routine. But when you're starting to learn something, even motor skills with your hands and applying that knowledge from your head to your hands in order to create the motion, you're creating new brain activity and new connections within your brain. So you're actually creating your brain to be more active. And so it's a very, very healthy process in order to do it. Now they say, which I totally agree with, that when you learn to crochet is that you get better at math because you're counting and the way that you're approaching the hobby. With knitting, it's the same way. They've actually done a study of children that actually knit before a math class, and they realized that the children do better, and it's because of the active brain waves that knitting and crochet can do. So just remember, when you're going to try this thing, you're strengthening your mind, and remember, it's not an overnight process. Number 5, when you choose your first knitting project, choose something that's doable within a reasonable time frame. So if you're going to choose a knit blanket, for myself, I can't imagine myself ever knitting a blanket based on the speed that it takes. So for me, for my first project to be a knitting blanket would be kind of not so. So what you would want to do is you want to create a project that is going to be done within about a week's time frame. So maybe a dishcloth, maybe a hat, maybe a scarf. You want to choose something small because you want the success to the milestone of the goal to be closer to you than something that's going to be crazy. In the future, you may learn to do knitting sweaters and cardigans and all of that jazz. But if you're new to knitting, why would you say that's standard? Because you probably will never get there. The other thing too is if you start a project and you quit on it, the needles have to stay with the project, and then you have to buy the needles again if you decide to keep it on to the side and try to do it later. So you want the first project that you do to be successful and to get to the end of the finish line so that you can use it for whatever you want and have lessons on at the same time. Number 6, part of my hang up that I've had before is that I quit. And it's like, oh, this is just a pain and I'm not gonna do it, like this sucks. And I set myself up for failure to quit. And what I've learned in this last 2 weeks is that I've gotten to those moments like, oh my goodness, this hat is gonna take forever. But then I hit a certain point, it's like, oh, you know what, I'm about halfway through, I think I can get through this thing. And I just have to get myself through the mental barrier of not to quit too early. So I find with myself, and it's like anything in life, if you really want something, like really want something, you have to push yourself in order to get to that goal. Knitting is no different. So be cautious not to quit too early, because ultimately you're giving up on yourself than anything. So don't quit too early. Number 7, the idea that you will make a mistake that we covered in number 1. The fact is, most of these errors can be fixed in later on. So when you think crochet and you make a mistake a few rows below, you have to frog it out to rip it, right? With knitting, it's called chinking. And what I've learned with this is that I saw a mistake about 4 rows down, and I don't have to undo the whole thing in order to get back to the 4 rows, but there's ways to get and just release one loop and just have the loops all open and then reset them with a crochet hook to bring them back up. So some of the mistakes that you may make are fixable, and sometimes you just have to be very patient. So a small crochet hook by your side is a really good tool to have, especially when the loops get kind of tight. So just make sure that when you make a mistake, you don't think that it's the end of the world, because chances are it's fixable, and sometimes they're not. But I have found with myself that I was able to fix some mistakes in Daniel's hat that I made for him, and you can't even see where I made the mistake because they're gone, because I was able to go down several rows in order to fix it, because I purled instead and did the net stitch, and it was very obvious. So just know that some mistakes are fixable. Don't panic. Number 8, I realized that some of the tools in knitting are not equal to each other. So the way that they glide, so I've learned the anatomy of a knitting needle. It's the tip and the barrel. And sometimes the tips and the barrels are different shapes in the different manufacturers. Sometimes the barrel is more slidey, so it's easier to move the stitches back and forth on the barrels itself. And so I have found that with knitting, maybe the part of the joy that is going to kill your opportunity is that maybe you're going to a dollar store or something and picking up the cheapest knitting needles that you can find, versus investing in the tools to do the job. So some people have best of luck with cheap needles and all that stuff, and other people, they prefer the higher end stuff. So my point being is that if you're quitting and you feel like you're fighting the needles, it actually may not be you, it actually might be the needle itself, and maybe you got to just change it. The tips, as I said, are different on the different manufacturers, so that the way that they're shaped, the point of them matters in your knitting. So you're going to be able to find your own way using the needles and choosing the needles that think that work best for you. It's like crochet. I love the ergonomics. Some people don't like it. You got to choose the hook that matches what you prefer and for your success. So the tools matter. Number 9, like crochet, when we do cable work, we can't actually see the cable work until we're a few rows into the project. I find with knitting is that once I'm beyond the 5th row, I get excited about it. So the first 1 to 5 rows, I'm like, oh, you know, why did I set myself up for this disaster? And I'm realizing that after I get through the 5th rows, I can finally see the texturing that I'm applying into the project, and then I finally get excited about it. So I found is that rows number 1 through 5 is a speed bump that almost makes me want to quit. But after I get through the 5th row, I finally say, okay, well, I've got this in the bag. So I have to say that when in the past, I've usually quit in the first 1 or 2 or 3 rows, not realizing that I just need to go a little bit further to see my work transition, because the stitches are a lot tighter than crochet, generally speaking, on the needles. You can't physically see and confirm what you're doing if you don't have the experience with your eyes, which is yours truly. So I found after I get through the 5th row, I'm good to go. So maybe that will happen for you. Who knows? So what has kept my interest in the knitting itself is the yarn itself. So I chose Red Heart Roll With It Melange in the color called Theater for Daniel. And because the colors are transitioning and doing all this fun stuff, I found myself visually being interested into the project because I want to see what this orange is going to look like, and I want to see how this browns are going to work out and how it's going to lay out in his hat. So they call that the stitching journey. So I found with myself is that the more colorful and playful the yarn is, the more interested I am to see how it's going to turn out. So if you feel like you may get bored because the color may be solid, choose some yarns that you think are going to be exciting, and you really don't know what it's going to look like until you get to the end. And I think that's what keeps me motivated. So I found myself, okay, I'm just going to do a few rows, put it down, continue to watch TV, and then I put it down. I was like, I really wondered what that color was going to look like, and then I pick it back up. So the curiosity of the color transitions has really kept me motivated. So maybe color transitioning yarn and all of those fun yarns would be kind of beneficial for you. So number 11, try to choose a pattern with at least 2 stitches. And so if you just choose the same stitch over and over and over, you're going to get pretty bored, where literally your brain will exercise itself better if you can play within 2 stitches or different combinations of stitches when it comes to that. I found with myself is that I was knitting 2, purling 2, knitting 2, purling 2. And in the very beginning of Daniel's hat, I was like, oh my goodness, I have to think and I think and think and think. And then all of a sudden I started daydreaming about, a craft show that I did years ago, and my hands are still doing it, but I'm daydreaming. And I'm realizing that the fact is that once you can get your hands in the motion of understanding the stitches and being able to do the texture, I found with myself I can start getting my hands to do what they're supposed to do without a lot of thought to it. But also when I look at my project, because there's different stitches being used, there's different textures, which keeps it more visually interesting for me because I can kind of see through the texture work of the milestones that's happening. And finally, number 12, probably the biggest tip of all, you have to understand on how the loops are going onto these knitting needles. If the loops fall off, you have to examine how exactly are they looped onto the knitting needle. This took a bit of time for me to understand, and when I say time, I'm not talking hours, I'm talking days, is to finally understand on how a loop is going on there. So if it slides off the knitting needle by accident, when you go to push it back on, if you don't put it on in the right with the right twist, it will literally stands out and it looks wrong. So you want to be able to examine the stitches. So what I'm trying to tell you, I think most of all, is examine how the yarn goes onto the loop on and then exits loop onto the next stitch. And once you understand that, if it ever falls off your knitting needles, if you have to push that loop back on, you just follow the strand on the way that the others look and make sure that the loop is put on in the same direction so that it's not backwards. So that has been the biggest tip for me. And because I understand that now, I'm not so worried that if a loop falls off, I know exactly the orientation of the loop. And that one for me has been a lifesaver. So that's number 12. So wherever you find your journey in knitting, it may not be for you. My tips may suck. There are so many more tips that I could share with you, but the fact is that we're at the ground level right now and I'm still learning, and I'm happy to share my skills that I'm learning with you. But also for myself personally is that for me, I'm doing this because I'm burnt out with the crochet at the moment. And so I'm trying to create those new brainwave connections in my own head to be able to do different motor skills and to learn something in order to keep my life a little bit more interesting. So I've got myself an autopilot with crochet, and so I'm trying to learn a new skill just to kind of get some new brain activity in my head. I know, who would have thought, right? So anyway, that's a good one, and we'll hopefully see you again.